Hello, today is September 10th, 2019. This is the conformance office hours, a subproject of SIG architecture. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start walking through the agenda. All right. If you have details, if you can add them, if you can add your attendees information to the list here, that'd be helpful. I don't actually see Hippie on the call though. John, I think you're the first one up with the first agenda topic.
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to, since we were basically, certainly from a conformance test promotion point of view, we're done with 116. So I just wanted to show people the progress we've made. You can kind of see that over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've added something like 25 to 26 tests and 17, something like that. And about half of them were all in the last release. So that shows, I think, that we're doing something right. I think that it's still like dramatically way too slow. But that's what the CAP, which is my next item here on my agenda, is about. I would also like, somebody have a comment?
You could be breaking up slightly, John.
Oh, sorry about that. I just wanted to put a little table here. Sorry, trying to display. I have one other person here with me. The table here showing the progress we've made over the last release cycle, which is pretty good. 61, it looks like. That's again, we all have discussed the behavior cap, which is my next item, which I have very little update on right now. But that I hope to dramatically increase this, on the order of 5 to 10-fold. But we'll see if that's possible. Anyway, that's it for this item, unless people have questions.
I had a quick question, John. Do you have any idea what so during that period, the scope of Kubernetes has grown as well? And I'd be curious to know whether we think we're closing the gap between conformance and Kubernetes, or whether that gap's getting bigger. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, actually, Hippie would be a great one. He seems to have joined to answer that. I think that it's, well, I'll let him answer.
We've, up to this point, been measuring things via endpoints. And while we've tried to look at the number of endpoints that we're hitting and increasing that, it's gone a bit slow. We have a slide in our presentation for that if we want to move on to that.
Okay.
Do we want to start that, or?
No, that's okay. We'll get to that. I guess I'll say, Quentin, my opinion is that we're still losing ground, mostly because I think we have so much backlog, and I think that the level of coverage we're doing maybe isn't. Like webhooks and CRD went GA, and they had decent conformance test coverage, and it was one of the first big things that's GA'd since we put in the criteria that they have to have conformance tests for GA. So that was a nice thing that I think, if we hadn't been pushing this over the last 2 release cycles or so, we may not have had. So I'm happy to report on that. I do think, though, that at best we've been keeping pace. I wouldn't be surprised if we're still falling behind.
That's okay. So in the context of my question, sorry, just to brief.
Go ahead, Quentin.
I was going to say that the context of my question was just sometimes it's useful to split those 2 problems in 2. So the clear the backlog problem and the prevent new stuff getting in without conformance tests problem. So it sounds like we've done that, and yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, we're trying not to continue to fall behind. I just think that without, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I don't know if everybody's following. So there's another effort within architecture, which I also am behind on pushing forward, which is this sort of prod readiness review / alpha, beta, GA criteria. And what I want to update that KEP with is a sort of way we can use tooling to start to ensure some of these things. Tooling where when you're going to actually promote, you'll get a bunch of things you have to do, like adding things into this conformance.txt for other things as well. But so anyway, trying to tighten up the process, I guess. But that's kind of a different topic than probably this group needs to think about.
Well, a part of this, it kind of does cover this group. And Hippie and I have talked about it pretty much at length to have eventually get a PR blocking job in place. The biggest problem we have right now is that we didn't have enforcement. Right? We have quote unquote policy, but a policy without enforcement is basically, it's like a banana republic law. It's only a law as long as somebody's there to enforce it. So getting the enforcement in place is probably a high priority for this cycle because it prevents, I've already think I counted like 3 or 4 separate APIs that didn't have any updated tests that got through somehow because they kind of got skunk worked through.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. And not everybody is as diligent about the process as the folks who did CRD and webhook, right? They're everybody unintentionally can, may not follow the process to the T.
Yeah.
While I'm talking, I'll give the update on this, which is basically no major progress. I guess I consider myself as the blocker on that. I need to get time to nail it down and develop it to the next level of sort of implementable. And I'm hoping that before we meet next, I will have something that we've already reviewed. I have Jeffrey here. He's new to the team here, and he will be helping work on actually developing this as we move it forward. But right now, it's just still just a provisional set of ideas without any concrete deliverables, and that's on me to work on.
I had a quick look at that KEP, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. And if there's anything I can do to help, more than happy to do that.
Okay, excellent. My plan right now is to kind of sit down and start to break out some of the components of what tooling we need and that sort of thing. Just try and make a more concrete implementable plan out of it rather than just like I said, a set of ideas. So probably, I mean, I plan to do that. If you have time and want to do that, that's fine too. And otherwise, review and critique of whatever I produce is valuable.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do it without you. You've given most of the thought to it up to now, I think. But I could, for example, come through Mountain View and sit down with you, and we could try and bash something out in the morning or something, if that's helpful. I'm not too far away, but if
that's a possibility. Yeah, I'm in Sunnyvale. Yeah, we could possibly do something like that.
I'll feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to do those kinds of things if you think they're helpful. If they're not, that's also fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's it for me.
You did have a comment here, or someone else had a comment. I'm not sure who wrote this one with the writing good conformance test doc.
Oh, sorry, that was me. I forgot to put my name on. I'll do that now.
I guess I should give an update. Quentin and Brad and I, was anybody else? Yeah, Dims was there, I think. We met and talked about the validation suites, and I have some action items on that. But essentially, roughly our conclusion was that as it's written right now, it's not so different from feature tags. And so we had some sort of, I don't have my notes with me right now, but I had some action items on sort of maybe a little bit of refinement around that, but basically it's not that different. Is that your recollection as well, Quentin?
Sorry, I was struggling to find a button. Yeah, I think what we decided was that a sort of general ability to kind of label tests and be able to, label them as having various properties and then filter on those was useful, and that would solve this validation and a bunch of other common
Yeah.
use cases.
And we talked about what I remember the action item means. We talked about the idea of possibly tagging existing EDEs with, or certainly conformance tests with some sort of feature tag that we could let the providers go and run those, or we could collect that data using something like API Snoop. And actually, you were probably there too. The idea being that we start to get potentially some data around whether various features are implemented by all the cloud providers and therefore can easily make a cloud provider profile. So it was sort of, the conversation evolved from validation suites to feature tags to gathering data on those feature tags, but I haven't written anything up on that yet. But any comments from anybody here would be useful.
Yeah, I think I did. I wrote that in a comment to the original PR. I think I wrote a sort of a counter proposal, which I think covers a lot of that general tagging and stuff. So we could use that. I mean, we could literally probably cut and paste that comment as a starting point for this tagging proposal,
Okay.
if that's useful. I can't remember where that thing is. It's a bit further down in the minutes.
Okay, so I hijacked your writing conformance test thing.
Yep. So Quentin, did you want to talk about this?
Oh, no, that's fine. Yes, I just wanted to find out. So there was a bit of confusion last time. I think there was a thought that Aaron had done some of this work, and then Aaron came on the call later and said he had not, and it still needed to be done. And I noticed that that it's sort of been open for almost 6 months now and bounced around a bit. It seems to me like a kind of cornerstone for a lot of the stuff. If we can't tell people like how to write conformance tests, then like a lot of the stuff is difficult. So I was just wondering if people agree with that. Is it important? I think it's very important, but there may not be agreement on that. And if it is, should we like get it done in the next 2 weeks or whatever?
I think it's generally a good thing, as folks have tried to promote or transmogrify current tests or change tests. I think having that detail there would be good, just in general, for as new tests get authored too as well. We have requirements. We don't for what it means to be promoted, but we don't necessarily have what it means to be a good test in detail. We have some of those requirements feed over and bleed through.
Yeah, we have exclusionary things basically, not aspirational.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
My thinking behind that was, I keep hearing that people are not writing, tests in general and conformance tests, etc. And yet it's not that easy if you're a relatively inexperienced Kubernetes contributor. There's no kind of place to go to and say, this is what I do, and these will be considered good. There's only a bunch of things that I shouldn't do. And then ad hoc complaints about these terrible tests. So I was hoping to like systematize that a bit, mainly to make it more likely that people will actually write conformance tests.
I think part of that is overdue by like, what year is this? I don't know. But another part of this too is that we created this monolith that we call the testing framework, right? And much like 2001 Space Odyssey, I sit there angrily throwing sticks at it without having enough resources to actually move the monolith. Because in part, writing good tests means that you have good infrastructure that supports your capabilities to writing the good tests, right? And we have a bunch of details and knowledge and stuff in the framework, but saying it's good, it would, I don't know, I can't stretch reality in that way. So I think that there's some good practices we should probably distill down, but like there's also some practical things that need to get done to So there's a little bit of both that we're going to need to try to push the ball on to make the ability or the capability of a novice person to be able to come in and understand and write good tests, reduce that barrier to entry, right?
Do we have, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of the stuff is somewhat automatable, and we can certainly write libraries to do some of the heavy lifting. Do we have like an actual, at least the beginnings of a task list there? Can we actually start dishing these things out? If somebody could like give me an issue, I could like go and write some code, but I just don't know what those missing things are, or the
So I think there's two things. I mean, I think Tim, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but I think there's the framework as a whole, and I'm not sure the details on what we would want to do to fix that. But the behavior-driven cap, right, is intended to build tooling, likely within the context of the existing framework, that does some of what you're talking about, Quentin, of like heavy lifting, of like generating some mundane boilerplate that we shouldn't have to make people write, and allowing them to just surgically insert the code that's important and needs human thought. Which I think that's my sort of dream of accelerating this conformance test writing. I think that's different than addressing the framework as a whole, and it's different than the document of aspirational what makes a good conformance test.
I was just assigned this 2 months ago, specifically, and this is not necessarily around any framework updates or anything else. It's just how do we currently write good tests? And we're in the middle of capturing all of the various exceptions and requirements and things, and our team is actively writing better and better tests. And so I think we're finally at the point where we can consolidate some of that, and I'd love to see, I'm glad to see everybody's having some of the similar issues and highlighting what we're working on, but I would love to see our feedback on the specific insights that we found, and maybe capture what others have seen as well, and go ahead and put that information finally into that good conformance test doc.
Okay, so I'll sort of interpret that to mean yes, it's assigned to you, and yes, you plan to do it quite soon.
Yes.
Excellent.
We've just been doing it, and you'll see when we get to the ticket, it's not all precisely this document. It's actually the requirements doc and a couple other places. It just hasn't hit here yet.
When you say the ticket, I didn't see any activity at all in that issue, so maybe I'm looking in the wrong place then.
Yep, I have not linked to that ticket yet. That's my bad. When we get to slide 4, there'll be a link to all of the other PRs and issues that have been related to helping us understand what it is to write a good test. But that information hasn't consolidated into any action on the reference ticket yet, right there, or that doc.
Okay. Gotcha. All right, thank you.
With that, did you want to share screen, Hippie, and you can kind of walk through it and direct notes?
I would like to share screen. Let's see if I can find the right button to hit over here. Cross your fingers. Tell me you can see my screen, and that will make me happy.
Yep.
Awesome. We've been the team here in New Zealand, and also there's one of us in the Western United States. I've been working on increasing our numbers and measuring our numbers we've been measuring numbers for a while, trying to find the right way to do it, and we've been actively working on increasing the numbers since June. And this is our way we've been measuring it in the past, and this is only stable endpoints. So the percentage of stable endpoints, the ones that have been hit by test at all. And that all important number for our group is what percentage of endpoints that we tested and is over there in the green. It's been pretty slow up until June. And it's because we had a lot to learn. And I think since June, the number and the ramping rate has gone up and to the right. I didn't do a graph, but You can kind of see it was 20 to 21, and then to 23 and 24 across June, July, and August, versus the first time we were able to measure back in October, when we added support for communicating which test the E2E binary was looking at when it communicated to the API server and having that logged in the audit logs. This kind of summary of what it's looking like, it's about 9 weeks now. Our goal was to increase the numbers that we've been looking at since October. In June, the big plan was we are going to increase by 16%. It's going to be so easy. And the strategy was, we've got this tool, API Snoop, and obviously there are these 10 tests that already hit 22 new endpoints that if we just go identify them and ask the group, can we just stick the conformance tag on there? That would be great. It would help us all be a happy, more conformant group of humans. That's not exactly what happened, but we did learn a lot. In the last 9 weeks or so, we've written, and the numbers are slightly higher now, we've probably written 18 or 19 tests. We've rewritten 6, and we've written, I think, 3 new tests from scratch now. The result was the numbers did increase a good percentage and faster than they have in the past, but not to my satisfaction, and probably not to maybe some other people's satisfactions. However, the biggest output, I think, of this was the updated documentation and conformance test writing guidelines that, as Quentin pointed out, are not precisely located in the right place, and we'll get on that. The next slide is the actual links to, this isn't all of them. This was the 3 ones that popped out higher. And the PR on the conformance docs for should kubelet API access not be allowed? It's an exception. It's part of writing a good test now, is at least a conformance test, is kubelet can't talk to, you can't talk to kubelet. And then it takes too long. Once we identify a test that needs to be written, writing it and letting it sit for 2 weeks is enough. Needing to wait a whole cycle or more is too slow. We've identified and merged that. Test names need to be literal strings. You can't start having a variable that changes, because it's hard for us to use our existing tooling to identify the test. And those have all been updated. So these were 3 of several that updated our conformance docs. We also clarified edge cases, like what is it that we want to test? We need to separate behaviors from tests. Thank you, John. This is definitely a thing that's going to help us all when we can have the definition of behaviors and someone writing tests and all that, those differences being separate. We've also uncovered endpoints that have never been used. I'll open this one up just for a minute because it's kind of funny. How do I click here, click here? This is an endpoint that we identified and said, pod template test doesn't have anything hitting it, and it's in stable core. So we wrote a test for it. And if you look down here, you'll see that John said it should be deprecated, but Brian said this was created way back in issue 170 and never implemented. We should document that it should not be added to conformance, and we should document that it should be disabled on most clusters. That was really cool, and part of the output. Another piece was nuances in fields. So I'll open these up real quick. This is how I was able to go through and we hope accurately identify alpha, beta, and GA fields based on these 8 different SQL expressions. It would be really cool if we could concretely say that those were the precise alpha, beta, or GA fields. We've opened up, and the same thing for feature gated. This is how we identify feature gates. And for required, if it has the word required in it, and for deprecated, those are all searching the description field. if we look at the output of those discoveries, we've made a PR to say, please add these new properties into the Open API field at some point in the future. We need to make sure they're the right ones. We could automate it, but we're in the process, and Tim is aware of that one. Anybody interested, please chime in. Because right now it's me guessing based on the research. I think it's pretty accurate, but it needs to be agreed upon by us as a community. This has been really fun, and significant collaboration between us and our conformance group is really going to help us directly define the behaviors and what our endpoints is. And that's going to lead to faster test writing and increase our conformance numbers, which I'm excited to do. So for the test writing for the next, because we're working on 2 projects. One is API Snoop, and one is measuring our coverage and increasing our coverage. To increase our coverage, we have decided to focus on, from API Snoop, the PodSpec umbrella issue, which currently has 4 fields. I'm having some trouble identifying fields that are of other object types or are arrays, and we're nearly done with that, probably early next week. I'm not going to open the umbrella issue, but if you'll take a look, actually, maybe I will. This has links to tickets we're currently working on. If you disagree with the priority, you have an opinion, please chime in. This is where we're at. If we go back to somewhere, we're also going to go on to container, and that'll be the next coverage thing that we generate. And it's likely that we'll be generating every object field coverage in the near future. Field coverage is going to increase. However, this is field coverage we're intentionally focusing on, and we need to agree as a community that we're no longer going to be focusing on endpoints and operations. So that number that has been increasing and up and to the right, we're intentionally not focusing on it. And we're going to be creating tests based on behaviors and fields. And we need to have a defined number of the number of behaviors and the number of fields so we can rise to the occasion. And the other thing is obviously continuing to update that documentation. We will make sure that goes into the PR mentioned by Quentin. I'm going to stop here for a moment. This so far has been around us, how we document, how we write, and how we define which tests we need to write. Is there anything, any insights or thoughts or at this point?
I had a quick question. Could you flip back to slide number 2?
On slide 2, we are there.
I was just curious what the meaning of these numbers is. So,
sure.
So, and this is, firstly, apologies, my knowledge might be out of date. So stable means what exactly? Is that GA?
Yep. So this is a funny thing. We didn't really go into super detail. I can tell you how the code decides. If the path for the API includes the word alpha, then that's alpha.
And alpha is not stable. Okay.
Go ahead.
And alpha is by definition not stable.
Yeah, that's right. And beta is another thing that's not stable. In the early versions of what we were deciding, any endpoint or operation that you could do towards the API server that did not include either of those was considered fair game and stable.
Okay, understand. And roughly a third and increasing of those have any test whatsoever.
That's correct.
And then the number in the right-hand side, is that a total percentage, or is that a percentage of the number on the left-hand side? No,
that's a total percentage. So basically, this is all of the tested, and within those that are tested, 20, like it's still, if it were 100, there were 32 tested. If there were 100, there are 20 conformance tested.
Okay, I gotcha.
And there's about 1,100 total endpoints, and I think there are around 480 stable.
Okay, and the optional ones, so there are, as I understand, optional endpoints which you don't need to implement in order to be conformant, because not everyone does. Are those included in the delta between 100% and the bottom right number of 24%, or?
No, they are. So there's deprecated was the only set of endpoints I definitely pulled out. We don't really have optional endpoints. We have optional fields. And that's why we've kind of come to this discussion. Do we really want to focus on endpoints?
Yeah, so exactly. So part of the issue is that we've been measuring this based on endpoints, which is not really, those are like gigantic buckets, right? So,
yeah.
And creating a pod, right? I mean, there's so many fields that go into that, and they can all have different values, and some of those fields are alpha, and some might be optional, like say the things that are Linux only. And not only that, but we don't even have the metadata in the schema to determine that definitively. So what Hippie is saying is like he has these nasty like or R-like expressions that are determining whether something is alpha or beta or not, or deprecated, and that's just not really sustainable. It's just the accuracy is just probably not that great. We do know that we're getting better. We're like we see here from this point of view of the endpoints, but we don't know that one of those endpoints might hide, another 1,000 tests we need.
Yeah, I think we'll all be really surprised by the numbers.
Okay. No. And my question was not aimed at kind of like shooting holes in our conformance test. It was just making sure that I understood the number. So 1/4 of all of our stable APIs have some conformance test against that endpoint, and that is, which is way better than
some sort of test, which may be one of many needed, but yes.
Okay, so that's sort of better than I was expecting, actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, the optional ones, I mean.
It may make more sense when I get into field coverage. Why? Because we don't have optional endpoints.
Understand.
And the metadata is not there.
We don't have optional endpoints from the point of view, like, as I understand it, we can't actually disable individual endpoints right now. But like, if
you can't disable the endpoints, but they can reply differently.
Okay, but like we do have optional endpoints conceptually. Well, so we have this issue we still need to resolve around, say, HPA. If you don't run some kind of metric server, then HPA is an endpoint that exists that does nothing. And so
that was sort of what I was alluding to. Is you can create these objects in the API and nothing happens, and presumably you could potentially still have a conformant cluster.
Right. There's no controller that's
Another thing that I don't know if I've noted in here in the slides at all is that when you are on a running cluster, the source of truth for the Open API Swagger JSON comes from the API server itself. And depending on the feature gates that you've enabled, and depending on, it may just be the feature gates, I'm not aware, but it actually changes what is available with the API. So I may have misspoke when I said that endpoints don't get disabled, but there's not a way for feature gates to identify the fields. Sorry, for feature gates to identify the endpoints from a static perspective, as far as I can tell. I can only identify looking at descriptions of fields to decide if a field is feature gated. I don't have the information to tell whether a endpoint is deprecated or feature gated. However, if we were actually to collect the Swagger JSON at the time the cluster is running and compare it to the git commit of the Swagger JSON that the server is running at, we could tell pretty much what the difference was. But does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I guess another question, are these numbers like intuitively correct? I mean, John, when you read those numbers, do they sound like about what you would have expected?
I mean, well, if I'm considering this from the point of view of behavior coverage, they're not remotely correct. They make sense sort of from this, like, we managed to hit these endpoints.
Yeah.
They seem roughly correct. Yeah, sure. I think that Yeah,
If
I
I were
think
to correlate,
it's hard to measure right now because we don't have the right metadata around what is truly optional, like even feature gated. Like we don't know whether that, like you said, like Chris said, feature gating.
there's a, I think what we're having here is that there are 1,100 operations. And for me, that means there are 1,100 different shaped containers on the other side of those endpoints. And
Right.
we only touch and fill a certain number of them. That just means whether the container was touched. Now,
Right.
now we're going to talk about, well, that container actually only fits these particular type of things to store in it. And that's the meteor part. And that's still not behavior, by the way. To me, behavior is the sequence of how you mix the stuff in the containers into a beautiful recipe that is meaningful.
Yes. All right. Why don't you keep going?
Okay. So any other feedback over the test writing and the documentation and what we're doing next? I guess if I were to, can I propose a vote that we don't, I mean, and however we need to do this, but that we stop focusing on endpoint coverage because it's really expensive time-wise and CPU-wise and a bunch of other things. And we don't need to do that now. I'm just going to recommend that we
I think that when we move the KEP forward around behavior stuff, we'll measure based on behaviors. But there's a lot of work to do to get there.
Okay.
Yeah, that was going to be my advice too. For all the faults in endpoint coverage, it's better than nothing. So until we have a better thing, let's at least keep what we have in place and somewhat.
Okay.
So just for clarity with that previous statement I made about enforcement, I do not think it would be bad, though, at least at this point in time, to be able to track any regression on a per PR basis. So if we had PR blocking jobs that prevented people from adding new endpoints without having test coverage, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Okay. Right now, the time it takes to map an entire, let's say, 400 meg of audit logs to match each of those audit entries to a particular endpoint is really CPU intensive and can take 30 minutes or more on a 56 core machine. So there's some optimizations and things that I'll go through in the slides that would help with that. Currently, it's a little bit difficult to do that per PR.
Yeah, this has been discussed, Tim. It's sort of like the operations as they're defined are actually in the schema are not real. They're sort of heuristically created by the code that generates the schema, and so then mapping them backwards is quite difficult. So I think that's something to think about if there's a way to do it that doesn't require that calculation. We may be able to do that.
I've got some things that we go over, some options. Anything else? All right, I'm going to move forward. To do all this measurement and PR blocking and stuff, we needed to take the tool from being just a static website generated from data and be able to answer new questions when they come up. Because every time we dig into something, like, well, what about this and what about that? And we have to go, well, let's figure out how to retool the processing. And we needed basically to get a database so we can look at the API surface from different perspectives and find multiple ways to interact with. And right now we're using Postgres and a GraphQL compliant database because didn't want to go down some document store database route. They didn't seem to do the type of tooling that we wanted out of it. And I also wanted to be able to use existing tooling for creating UIs and for graphs and for meaningful representation of that data. We needed to decouple it from the UI. We were spending a bit too much time trying to retool it to fix the UI, and we just needed to have data separate so we can answer questions quickly as they come up around the data sets. We also want to be able to do coverage over time a lot easier, and that's going to be easier to do when we can have all the data into one set versus currently processing it one at a time. And when we're finding things, again, they don't always fit into the UI. So far, we've been investigating PodSpec field coverage. I think that it's currently down because I've been looking at some other stuff and updating it. We can come back to it, but the PodSpec field coverage went through and showed us that ticket that we prioritized which fields we're going to be writing on. We also went through and uncovered all fields related to PodSpec. Is that also a link? That's not a link. All the fields related to subfields related to PodSpec, I think numbered around 300 or so. It's all the descending things, and it gets complex. And being able to choose which of those fields are either required or GA or feature gated, or it was part of being able to select and narrow that down. I showed you some links earlier where we were able to turn this tribal knowledge of when we said, we're going to focus on this new endpoint. And I think Liggett or someone wrote back, that's not available for conformance because it's an alpha endpoint or because it's feature gated. And I was like, how do I know that? And they said, it's the documentation. So that turned our tribal knowledge into actionable, queryable fields. This was the 4, I think we now have 5 or 6 fields that we're focusing on for the completely untested PodSpec fields. We did write that one test for a pod template and realized that Brian said that was never implemented, so it should be deprecated, which will take, obviously a year to deprecate, but we need to document that people should disable it probably. Most of our audit logs are somewhere between 250 and 400,000 audit lines, audit entries. And within those, there are, it was funny that when I wrote this the first time, it was 66,600. And last I checked, there was 71,000 some odd field combinations. Those entries don't have information linking them to API operations. Each of them has to be looked up using a regular expression and the HTTP method to say, here is the HTTP verb and this random URL that we need to match. And it's really intense. I think, is this the ticket? No, that's not a ticket. One option that we have is to require that the audit logs include another annotation when they're logging that includes the operation ID. At that point, we could have a PR job that does this and reports back in like 60 seconds. It's really fast. It's just, we can't do that if we don't have the ability to do this mapping quickly.
This is where from the discussion, we found that that's not really feasible because those are fabricated. Is that correct?
I think it might be possible to look up. I think I'd mentioned, someone else had mentioned possibly feature gating this feature so that we can use this feature when we're doing our CI blocking jobs. And nobody else has to be afraid of this alpha feature that we introduce tomorrow that stays alpha forever because it's only used to for us.
Can we, yeah, okay, maybe I misunderstood the discussion. I thought the discussion said, well, we don't really know the client doesn't really know what the operation is because those operation IDs are made up, but maybe it can construct it somehow.
So my comment was that you could bake this into the API server if you wanted to as part of the tooling, but disable it by default and turn it on, and you'd probably be okay.
We'll explore that route. I think it's a requirement if we want to continue to have PR blocking jobs that use this information.
Yeah, I think we should think about if there's another way, but yeah, that's okay. I guess we should explore all the options there. Definitely, there's a bunch of metadata we want to add to the schema.
Yes, and one of the tickets we looked up earlier was a direct request to add it, and we could automatically create a PR that includes all the right metadata added to the source code so that it shows up in the OpenAPI spec definition. We just need to push that forward. Beyond the operation ID, the body of the API Chris has a full Kubernetes object, and it needs to have each of those JSON fields compared to the correct OpenAPI parameter. And when we do that, we actually could have not only the value and sub-value of all of the possible 77,000 field combinations that were used, but the fields. So you could say, well, there's a particular value that we're not testing. It's always set to true, and it's a binary. Would we ever set it to false? And that will give us a real wide eye opening things.
So can I ask just quickly, just so
Sure.
I'm sure I fully understand it, the 66 or the 71,000 field combinations, you're saying those fields exist in the body of the request, but you're not
Yep.
saying the specific values of those fields?
Every request includes some of those fields filled with some value.
Okay.
There are possible 70. Go ahead.
We don't differentiate because maybe we don't. Do we look at whether those are default values? Like, are some of the requests might be explicitly setting values that would be the default anyway? So that might be something we want to look at.
Yeah. No, I don't. I just say whether it's set. We're just trying to get to the point where is it set or not?
Okay.
And then the next step is, what is it set to? And then the next step would be, is that value interesting to us because it's the default or not?
Okay.
This is the example of II being the PR blocking job. JBets they were promoting admission webhook, and I noted what noted was our conformance coverage was going up and to the right, and then it dropped, and I was confused because we've been working hard, and I didn't want to look like we were being lazy. I think there was a comment, how long until it drops through the floor? So at this point, we went through and used API Snoop to identify, here is the particular endpoints you are trying to promote. Here are where you have existing tests that could be conformance, please promote them. Here is one remaining test that's gray, that's not written at all. These are all of the endpoints. When you do this, you're good to merge according to our policies. This is what we're talking about when we want to have a PR blocking job.
So you're saying this is something you did manually, but this is what you did. Yeah.
This is me being the bot. At some point in the future, this will be a bot.
This is hippie bot.
This is II need this to work. I'll go on from that one. I think that's really straightforward visual of why we need the blocking around the gate. And so for the next 4 weeks, 3 weeks or so now, I was trying to generate data coverage so that we know that it's been hit, possibly the value for all field combinations. Obviously, we're going to have that stuff for PodSpec. We're going to have that stuff for container. We also are going to look at deployments and replica sets as a higher priority. After that, there's parameters, because watch is a parameter. We've deprecated all endpoints that start with watch. And so to understand how we could automatically write some tests to iterate over all objects at their current revision, and then put a watch on all of them, and then update any mutable values, all of a sudden we've got a heap that we hit an endpoint related to coverage will make the number on that first chart jump considerably. I think. I don't know what the number is going to be, but it's going to be good. We don't do any of the responses, low priority, but because we're doing the data set, those are both the object types and we are not, I'm thinking we're not going to be updating our new site to use the backend because we're talking about deprecating it, the data, but it sounds like we're going to keep that on. We talked about the processing. I'd like to save those 30 minutes via the feature gate to record the operation ID. I don't know that we'll get that because that's on other people to agree or to find a way where we have that feature gate to record that ID so we can have these metrics in our audit logs. I think it's going to take more than 4 weeks to do that one. And I think it's also going to take more than 4 weeks to get API Snoop running in the cluster. That's not true. I got that running last week. And then I think it's going to take beyond 4 weeks for the PR job. This is the priorities on both conformance test writing and how we're trying to measure that. And I just want to make sure that everybody agrees with what we're choosing to do and that what we're doing is helpful and useful. I'll leave, the next slide just basically says, are things meaningful? But I'm going to move it back up so the list is still there.
I think it's meaningful. I think we know the changes we need to make, and this gives us an idea of the scope of the problem, or some more idea of the scope of the problem. I did have a question. Support running API Snoop in the cluster. That's just running it in the cluster, not using a webhook instead of a log analysis. Correct?
Right now, what I have currently right now is it running in a cluster doing exactly what it did before.
Okay,
what I hope to in 4 and plus weeks is to have it running in cluster as a hook and using the work. Actually, I was just, is it over here? Knative has an API coverage webhook that I'm exploring.
Oh, cool.
And that would be fun to see how we can integrate that work. But that's 4+ weeks. Can't do it all this month.
Yeah.
Anything else?
To me, I guess I'll keep talking. I think it's useful, the things you're uncovering around changes we need to make to the conformance test criteria and to the API metadata and things like that to make this all work better. So I definitely want to see that continue. And if you can distill the things you've learned into the best practices already, the performance test document that we talked about earlier, I think that would be valuable as well.
Yeah, it would be good. We'll be sure and do that. Thank you all for your support. I specifically want to reach out to SpiffX and Timothy and John and Neolit and Liggett and Dravness and MG DevStack and all the people who have been part of the conversations and actively triaging PRs and closing stuff for us. It's super fun and exciting to get a chance to work with you all. That's all for me.
I have a few questions to discuss, AP.
Yep.
So basically, like what I have seen, like basically our first priority task is to improve coverage on the pod spec, and what I've seen, like we have tried to promote existing E2E on those areas, but still there are a lot of the entry points where we have to improve the coverage. Like first of all, if we try to see on the container side, as you were saying, so few of the issues we had raised, like how we can start writing new E2E with new scenarios. So definitely, like the way John is working on the behavior requirements, which would be ultimately improving the actual field coverage, what you were pointing. So definitely, like one part is completed, like from promoting existing E2E, but definitely we have to think about writing new E2E as well. So how we can actually boost up this second part, like first of all having the good scenarios and then start writing those E2E. So how we can
I'm gonna. So what I think, and this is what we're focusing on at the moment, is to identify fields for now, and focus on increasing those fields. And so we've identified the umbrella ticket with specific fields that don't have coverage, because our primary goal right now is to increase field coverage for PodSpec, for example. And we're focusing on writing a test for that field. And that should bring the scope down to, does it test something important? It's not a full behavior yet, because we don't have that to run off yet. And I don't think we should spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out the whole behavior before we keep improving the coverage. So I would suggest choosing one of the endpoints that we've identified and writing for that, while we as a group collectively figure out what does it look like to have the more complex ingredients mixed together into a beautiful cake of that, behavior style.
Yeah. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, so in order to this kind of the efforts, like we tried to do in the previous time as well, like if we try to see one of the issue number 77973, so that is focusing on improving the field coverage for the resource quota. So if we get some kind of the subject matter experts to point their views, like whether these kind of the scenarios are effective or not, so that would be real good. So if any of the member can start writing those E2E, at least it would ensure like the behaviors are good enough, and we can start writing those E2E in conformance perspective.
Can you repeat that PR again? I was just going to pull it up.
So it's issue number 77973.
I think we're getting close on time, but issue.
Yeah, we're out with issues. Yeah, this would that sounds like a behavior. Yeah, well, it says it in the title.
Right now we're at time, so.
Can you assign that to me, Mike? Because I didn't see it. And I see I'm tagged there, but there's so many things that go through the CC that they can be missed. And then
yeah, I also want to reiterate too that like for everyone working on the conformance working group, unless we're assigned to an issue and you CC us, given that a lot of us are old timers, that goes straight to /dev null. So unless we're assigned, that's the only way we can actually accurately triage the issues and PRs as they're inbound.
Got it.
Also, area conformance is good.
Yeah.
I've added that.
But we're at time, so we can review that, and maybe as an action item for this meeting, we can follow up on that particular issue. So I want to call it. So thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
See you. Bye.